of the Grants and Resources Subcommittee. We are booked today until 3 p.m. My name is Megan Wiley. I'm with Sacramento State University. I provide facilitation support to the task force of the Grants and Resources Sub. Whoa. Oh, we're good? Okay. It's awful to hear yourself on recording. Also with us today is the fantastic staff from Strategic Growth Council. In the conference room, we've got Camille and Caleb. At the home office, we have Tessa. And also joining us for the first time today, we've got Doug Bojack. He's with the legal team at Strategic Growth Council, and Doug is with us to provide some more context and help us answer questions related to Prop 209. So that'll come up for us in about 15-20 minutes. Let's fly through the next couple slides. Would you mind advancing us? So our participation guidelines for all meetings of the task force and its subcommittees is to treat each other with kindness and respect, to share the time together, to listen to each other's ideas and comments, and foster a space of mutual learning and exchange. And staying on point is really important. So this is a conversation for the Grants and Resources Subcommittee. So we're containing the conversation to topics related or items related to that subtopic. Next slide. We've got a few members of the public joining us today. Thank you for being with us today. Welcome. We do make space for public comment in all of our meetings at the end of scheduled agenda items, and then at the very end of the meeting for general comments. And if you're interested to get into the discussion queue and share a comment with us, a couple ways to do that. One is to complete this form here. You see that the URL up at the top, sgc.ca.gov/meetings-events. If you wanted to fill out a form for each item you want to speak to, we'll know that you're looking to get into the conversation queue for that item. Otherwise, you can also just raise your hand on Zoom, and then we'll know to unmute you and then open the mic so that you can share your comment at the appropriate time. The raise hand feature should be at the very bottom of your Zoom screen there. And we ask for about a 2-minute time limit on comments for all of our meetings, and it'll help us keep track of that as well. We can review these processes too as we get closer to the public comment sessions. We've got it set up so that folks are muted upon entry, and sometimes we have to remind you to unmute yourself when it's time to speak, or to mute yourself when we're done speaking to help maintain background noise. We'll help with that if we need to. So apologies in advance if we kind of mute you or unmute you accidentally, but you should know you've got power of that, and your mute unmute buttons on the left-hand side. Cameras are optional, but it is so lovely to see smiling faces. And so that also includes members of the public joining us here today as well. So when it comes to conversation time, you're welcome to turn your camera on. Next slide. What's our plan for this afternoon? First, we need to review and approve our prior meeting summaries. So we had a meeting in July and a meeting in September of 2024. So we'll do a quick check on that, see if any edits are needed, and get approval from our subcommittee members. Then we have a section on research updates and discussion. So our staff team from Strategic Growth Council will lead us through what they've been working on over the last couple months by way of grant program updates and land access policy incentive examples and outcomes, examples from other states. And then we'll have some conversation about how we might apply that to the California context. We'll pause after that section. Oh, also underneath that umbrella is the Prop 209 conversation. We'll pause there, check in for public comment, and then the second half of the afternoon is a working session. And under this session, we would like to spend some time talking about preliminary recommendations. So we're always trying to do, right, is to get the task force members thinking about how are we advancing the recommendations, and they did some fantastic work together in November at their full task force meeting. So we've been able to build upon those conversations over the last couple months. We're going to check in on where we're at with that. The working groups have been doing some work also on the back end. We'll check in with the working groups and we'll talk about a plan for next steps. Next slide. Quick roll call to establish quorum. When I call your name, please unmute yourself and say here for the record. Member Doria Robinson.
Here.
Member James Nakahara.
Here.
Member Leah Schwartzman.
Here.
Member Thea Rittenhouse.
Here.
Fabulous. Quorum is established. All members of your subcommittee are present. Thanks for being with us here today. All right, first item of business, approval of summaries, one from July 10th, 2024, and another from September 18th, 2024. Both summaries were circulated to the subcommittee members and are available on the website. I will just pause and see if any of the subcommittee members would like us to pull up either the July or September summary, and if you have proposed edits. Okay. Hearing none, may I have a motion to approve the summaries as written?
I move to approve the summaries as written for July and September.
Thanks, Doria. Do I have a second?
I second that motion.
Thank you, Thea. And we'll do a quick roll call. I'll say your name. You can unmute yourself. Aye if you approve, nay if you disagree. Member Thea Rittenhouse.
Aye.
Member Doria Robinson.
Aye.
Member James Nakahara.
Aye.
Member Leah Schwartzman.
Aye.
Great. Full summaries are unanimously approved. We'll get those finalized and posted the final version on the project website and circulated to the task force. Oh, I did not pause for public comment on the meeting summaries. My mistake. Is there any public comment on the meeting summaries? Okay. Seeing none. Thank you. The motion stands. Next up, research updates and discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Tessa to start us off with this conversation.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to provide a really quick update on the grant program research, which we talked quite a bit about at the last subcommittee meeting. We're still working on this research. And just a really quick reminder, so this subcommittee requested data on the demographics and the outcomes of key California grant programs. We selected 12 to analyze a bit more in depth. And the scope of those programs was essentially programs that either conserve or conserve ag land or provide access in some way. And we ended up picking 11 California programs and one federal program that felt particularly relevant. And so over the past couple months, I began to scan the program guidelines and what was available online about regarding the different metrics that we had discussed that you all wanted to learn more about, and essentially decided to request this data directly from program leads based on the amount of data that we could really gather from what's just online. And so have created this questionnaire for program leads that we will send out to each of those 12 programs. You can see the short list of information that's included in those questionnaires, which is essentially the metrics that we discussed last meeting. And we're asking for the most recent 5 years that the program has been in operation. So those aren't necessarily consecutive years if the program skipped a year or some other situation. And we are hoping to share those results with you at the next subcommittee meeting, whenever that's planned or whenever the data is essentially ready. And I just wanted to share a couple thoughts about what the results might lead us to. As Megan said, subcommittee recommendations, of course, because that's always what we're thinking about. But there's sort of two outcomes that we could anticipate from the responses that we get to this questionnaire. The first is if we get really limited responses because the questions we're asking just don't have maybe the data sources that maybe this data isn't being tracked essentially, or maybe very few programs are actually able to get back to us. So in that case, I think the recommendations can potentially look like identifying gaps in knowledge, right? And kind of noting that maybe noting what you guys want to see more of. So if that's more record keeping, if that's more monitoring, and being able to kind of establish that baseline. So that's one route. If we get a really strong set of responses, what this data set could look like is essentially reporting out on like a baseline impact of these existing programs. So these 12. And then you all could start thinking about what that baseline means as far as ag land equity goes, and essentially what equity then means in this context of improving grant programs. And so if we do get a strong set of responses, we'll have information on dollars spent and acres transitioned or impacted. And so then, for example, you all could think about, okay, if we're transitioning 100,000 acres annually with these programs, what is, a more equitable outcome or result of these programs look like in the future? Is it doubling that acreage? Is it identifying who actually gets to benefit from those 100,000 acres that are transitioned? So those are the types of questions that I'm kind of thinking about, and you all will get to dig into essentially when this data is ready to be reviewed. So happy to take any questions, but that was really just my quick update. And we can move on to Caleb if there's no other questions. Oh, Doria, I see your hand.
Yeah, just to clarify, have you already sent the questionnaires out, or is that a task that needs to be done? And what do we think the turnaround time might be?
Yeah, good question. So we initially reviewed kind of the plan and the questions that we wanted to send out with one program, and we're kind of just waiting to hear their feedback. And so that should happen within the next couple of days. And then the plan is to send that questionnaire out whenever that's ready. So maybe next week, ideally. And then giving like a month turnaround time. So that was kind of the goal. And then a little bit of analysis. So perhaps by the end of February, which I think would work with the next subcommittee meeting, but we'll talk about that at the end of the meeting today. Yeah.
Just a quick question of the 12, how many are state versus federal sources?
Yeah, it's 11 state and then 1 federal. And that was because in previous conversations, this subcommittee had talked about wanting to prioritize state. But then the 1 federal program we decided to analyze just felt really relevant to the work we're doing. That's the Land, Capital, and Markets Access Program at USDA. Anyone else? All right, well, yeah, I'll pass it over to you, Caleb.
Okay. Yeah, so we heard from the subcommittee a desire to learn and know more about other grant, loan, and incentive programs from other states in the US outside of California, and kind of how those programs are supporting agricultural land access. And so what staff did is conduct a literature review of existing research on these, or on policy incentive programs, kind of seeing what the research is out there and what it says. And then we also conducted a state-by-state analysis or research of what other states are doing and what their policies and programs are that kind of help facilitate land access for beginning farmers. And then we compiled that into a large Excel spreadsheet. I'll talk more about this later, but that Excel spreadsheet can be accessed in the briefing packet, and it's also in the Google Drive. So looking first at kind of the literature review that we did, the research that we found focused primarily on 3 types of land access policy incentive programs or policies. The first are beginning farmer tax credits. So these are state level tax credits for state level taxes that go to agricultural asset owners who sell or lease their assets to beginning farmers. And assets here is pretty expansive. It could be land, it could be equipment, it could be livestock, it could be other things, but those are kind of the main three. And then there's also the Federal Conservation Reserve Program Transition Incentives Program. So this program is through the federal government, and it provides farmers with payments for transitioning environmentally sensitive land into or kind of out of production, putting vegetation on the land, developing riparian buffer zones, things like that, in an attempt to kind of say or counteract erosion that's happening on the land, or kind of protect streams and waterways. And so when that happens, farmers enter into a contract with the government, and the federal government pays them money for doing this. When those contracts expire, there's the Transition Incentives Program. The Transition Incentives Program continues those payments for an additional 2 years. If the owner of that land sells or leases their land to a beginning farmer. So kind of a double financial incentive there, maintaining the federal government payment, but then also receiving rent or the payment from the sale of that land to a beginning farmer. And then there's also state level agricultural easement incentive programs. So these are direct financial support to beginning farmers to help protect land with agricultural conservation easements, and then it also helps the beginning farmers purchase that land. So just quickly going over some of the key research findings that we found from this research. One of the primary ones is that little is actually known about their effectiveness, impact, and reach. There's been identified a need for more research, and a lot of the research that we did review was relatively recent, 2023, 2024 research, and a few scholars were really kind of leading the way on this research. So there was kind of a general overlap of scholars in the research that we did find. We also found that the research was and the writers of the research were very unwilling to make strong comments about any correlation between these programs and actual success in getting land into the hands of farmers. But they did suggest that the policies may slightly increase the number of farms owned by beginning farmers and help beginning farmers stay in the profession longer. They also found that the policies are often well utilized and regarded or ranked highly by both beginning farmers and the owners. But they identified that these programs generally tend to benefit and are kind of designed for larger parcel sizes and broad acre operations, not small or diversified farming operations. And they also note that these programs oftentimes, particularly the Beginning Farmer Tax Credit and the CRP TIP program, they provide more of an indirect incentive to beginning farmers. Rather, the direct incentive is to the owner. One of the articles even said that these programs pay landowners as gatekeepers of land access. So something to note. Then continuing on with some key findings, the research showed that participants in these programs are often overwhelmingly white and male. We're talking oftentimes over 90%, and oftentimes even 95% or above are white men. And they also identified that there is low first generation participation in these programs. The highest figure that I saw was 20% first generation participation for a beginning farmer tax credit program out of Minnesota. I'll note that a lot of this research was done on kind of the Midwestern plain states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Minnesota, and Nebraska. Looking at beginning farmer tax credits specifically, they found that in about half of cases, the tax credits were going to already existing relationships. So the owner and the beginning farmer were already had a lease agreement, and the beginning farmer tax credit was just applied for and already benefiting that pre-existing relationship. And then about over 70% of the program participants in these programs still said that they had land access challenges after participating. And then some key factors that the research identified for affecting or influencing program participation and program effectiveness is spatial mismatch. So where the land is available for these programs, beginning farmers and ranchers tend not to be geographically close to those areas. And that kind of goes into the next point where they said that kind of the lack of relationships or insufficient relationships between landowners and the socially disadvantaged farmers is a big impact and a big hindrance to participation in these programs. And also related is note that there's kind of a lack of cultural and social infrastructure where this land is available. Again, just kind of pointing to that geographic disparity where the beginning farmers and ranchers just aren't really located where the land is available. And then they also noted that awareness of the programs just generally is also a big barrier to participation. So should I stop for questions there? Any quick questions on anything that I've said so far? Seeing none. Now talking about that state-by-state analysis that we conducted. So again, we looked at all 49 states except for California to determine what policy incentive programs that they have. We looked at different grant programs, loan programs, and then other incentive programs. And we found primarily 3 programs or policy types that were most common in other states. The first being low interest loans. So here the state is providing normally tax exempt bonds to lenders in the hope or expectation that those lenders will then provide financing to beginning farmers at lower interest rates for land acquisition or other agricultural needs. And then beginning farmer tax credits, which we talked about earlier, and then also grants. Grants were less common, but they were quite a bit more diverse. The grants ranged from things like succession planning to funding actual land purchase, but all of the grant programs that we did identify do help prioritize or support beginning farmers or ranchers accessing land in some way. And the last quick note is just that the states define beginning farmers in a lot of different ways. The 2 main ways that they define them are either by age or years of experience. So some states say 18 to 35 or 18 to 40 is considered a beginning farmer. Other states say years of experience, so 5 years or less or 2 years or less experience working in the agricultural industry. What's that? Yeah.
So we wanted to pause here and see whether anyone, well, thank you, Caleb, first I will say for doing all of that research. And wanted to pause here and see whether subcommittee members had anything you wanted to speak to right now. I wanted to also highlight these questions. I think it will be important to actually think a little bit about some of the policies impacting the way that state programs are designed. So that's that point about bringing us back to the California context after hearing about some programs in other states. So we can either, if you have ideas to these questions, you can talk about them now, or we can save them till after that kind of California context discussion. But wanted to take a moment and just see, before we come back to the state of California, is there anything that subcommittee members would like to say or address or go back to in the research about programs in other states? And that kind of the early findings about the policy incentives in particular and their efficacy. So I see Thea, your hand is raised.
Thanks, Camille, and thanks, Caleb. This is very robust research that you did. So thank you. Appreciate all of your time that you've spent on this. And I did have a chance to take a look at some of the, I appreciate that you included the direct links to some of the studies and articles that were, journal articles that were written. I have a question in the non-California based programs. I don't remember reading this, but was there any indication of like programs that were like most successful models, and were any of these combined in a state where it was a combination of more than one of these programs that led to potentially more beginning farmers getting access to land? That's my first question. And I think I'm remembering also there was an example of a case where I can't forget what state, where there was a land trust or someone was able to take, I think it was bonds, and hold the money to facilitate that land transaction quicker. But the land trust then actually could access the land and then transfer it to a new or beginning farmer. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that example and if it was successful. I didn't have a chance to read like too in depth, so maybe you could speak a little bit more to that too, please.
Yeah, so regarding the first question, one of the states that has, or that the researchers kind of suggested has done really well in this regard is Minnesota. They have quite a few new programs as well. And then in terms of states that are doing multiple programs, yes, the Excel spreadsheet with all of the different states in their programs, there are a lot of states that have multiple different programs. Minnesota is one of those as well. On the specific case study, though, I'm not familiar, or I don't remember that case study. I did a lot of the research on the papers a couple of months ago, so.
But that is, Thea, to note that that's something that stuck out to you is helpful, because we can always go back into that, find that case study and pull that out and kind of share that, right, as something to discuss at a future point. Think about that as a model.
Thank you. Yeah, it was the holidays, so no worries. But I do, and maybe Leah knows more about that type of a model. But it seemed like it would address a barrier of, the competition and lack of sales, public sales of land, and that addressing that so that there's less of a barrier for beginning or new or socially disadvantaged farmers to get access to parcels of land.
Yeah, you're specifically talking about examples where there is policy or programs that support Buy, Protect, Sell.
I don't remember it saying Buy, Protect, Sell, Leah. It was just a case where there was funding that a land trust or another organization was able to be like an intermediary, where they would get the funding was there in a pool. And they could use that money to buy land and then kind of transfer the ownership to an individual business owner. I can't remember the state. I will find that out. Sorry for creating confusion.
That sounds like a helpful model to explore and look through that, actually how that worked. Leah, does that sound familiar to you? Anything you've heard in California that works in quite that way, programs that support that kind of transaction?
I mean, yeah, the Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation Program, obviously, we've had some conversations about it that can facilitate transactions in that way. But I do think that there's more support and attention for us to enable and even mandate more transactions with SALC that are Buy, Protect, Sell, or Buy, Protect plus transactions to facilitate land ownership for farmers. So that's definitely an area that we can dive further into, and that there's a huge amount of opportunity. It's a very successful program. So with just kind of a shift over to some of the desired outcomes of that program, it could be and is starting to be a really valuable tool. And just to kind of add as well, also seeing exploration of projects Similarly, that are beyond land trusts, there are other organizations that can act in that capacity, such as resource conservation districts. And so I think that the role of these kind of intermediary landholding organizations that can facilitate a quicker purchase and acquisition of land that is more competitive than maybe a beginning farmer could be on the open market. There's a real role for those types of intermediary organizations. So yes, and
Yeah, I did find, I went back and found that quote in the article. Washington State. And Washington State, they have an Office of Farmland Preservation, and there were several other actors. There's no chat in the webinar, so I can't add it there, but
we'll find it or reach out to you if we, for some reason, don't. But thank you for highlighting, and thank you, Leah, for answering that question. Are there other comments now, just on observations from what you did here now? And I wanted to quickly say also to the members of the public who are perhaps listening into this, the briefing materials do have that link to that spreadsheet that is mentioned here. Those briefing materials are accessible on the program website. So these are public materials. Just wanted to note that. Any other comments or thoughts now? Okay, let's spend a little time. So we will come back to thinking about how these kinds of models might be valuable, or how this subcommittee might want to learn from these models to make particular kinds of proposals to the task force. But before we kind of get back to those ideas in that conversation, it did seem very important and seemed like a good moment to have a discussion about some of the very specific policies and regulations that impact how funding programs, public programs in California can be designed, right? And the kinds of priority communities that can be included in those program designs. So there are two, we're highlighting here two important pieces of that context. First is Prop 209, which maybe everyone on this call is familiar with already in some way, but I think it'd be nice to address that here together as a group and think through it. And so we did invite Doug Bojack, Senior Staff Counsel at LCI, which is the sort of sister agency for SGC, where we all work, to say a little bit about Prop 209 from a legal perspective. And then also we have a slide just to say a bit more about the California Climate Investments definition of priority populations as one of the ways that equity is advanced through state programs. So we'll start actually with this brief overview of Prop 209. And Doug, I will of course let you say more, but Doug did mention that as this would really be a moment if you have questions as he's speaking to ask that here, so we can also let him log off after this. Thank you, Doug, for being here with us. I'll just say these couple quick points here and then turn it to you. So this brief description of this is also in your briefing packet. Prop 209 was passed by California voters in 1996. It's now part of the state constitution. And it prohibits preferential treatment in public employment, education, or contracting on the basis of race, gender, or national origin. So preferential treatment would mean setting aside specific kinds of funding or prioritizing on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, national origin. So I will pass it to you now, Doug, to say a bit more.
Thank you. And I'd just like to point to that last bullet here, which is that any sort of legal analysis of a Prop 209 question is going to be highly dependent on the facts. It does get very intricate in terms of meeting the intent and effect of the law. So if you do have questions and we start getting into the weeds of questions, I'd like to follow up individually with any members who have very detailed questions, because that does get highly dependent on facts that I want to follow up on. But we can go to the next slide here. Thank you. So these are general sorts of categories of how LCI and the task force in general can accomplish work that that follows the mission of increasing diversity and but while still remaining compliant with the restrictions that Prop 209 creates within California's contracting and by extension grant making world. And so the first sort of set of programs and possibilities are programs that are targeted by race or gender, but do not provide preference or benefits based on those categories. And so you can think of this in terms of programs that make special efforts to reach out to categories of folks who might not have information about particular programs availability or what it entails, conducting additional technical assistance, and doing that sort of work to level the informational playing field, as it were, and making sure that outreach can get to sort of priority communities. Again, not prioritizing applications or funding based on those categories, but just to get the information out as widely disseminated as possible. And then sort of on the back end of that would be conducting and evaluating data and receiving information about applicants and about interest and integrating that data on categories that are of interest in evaluating work on outreach or grant making and just kind of tracking that internally, because that again does not create a preference based on those categories. A second sort of bucket that we can talk about are programs that are not targeted by race or gender, but that are targeted by factors that support an organization's mission and are sort of related to that diversity and equal opportunity work. And I think we'll have a slide right after this talking about the CalEnviroScreen tool. That's something I think that would fit very well within this category, where you can use a basket of indicators, a basket of evaluating markers to try and reach what you're trying to do, but it is not again dependent on a prohibited type of status, whether it's race or gender, national origin. If you are looking at sort of in the case of Prop 2, or excuse me, in the case of CalEnviroScreen, it's described as a pollution burden. So it's a combination of factors, including income, pollution metrics and data, and you make a composite score, and you can sort of create a way to evaluate and prioritize communities that in a way that is compliant with the law. In our third bullet point here, programming can be related to race and gender, national origin, as long as it's open to all, as long as programs like speaker series, roundtables, information reports, as long as they're available to anyone who requests them, not based on a selective basis of race, gender, national origin, then that is perfectly fine for the state to engage in. And then the final bullet point here, also, and the state doesn't have to engage in it at all. LCI and SGC have worked extensively with non-state organizations in NGOs to provide grants and other benefits that they can provide because they do not face a restriction implemented by Prop 209. And LCI and SGC can provide routine assistance to these organizations, providing information, support, access to facilities, noticing, outreach, anything like that, as long as it's not provided on a discriminatory basis, so that anyone who's working on issues that are within the mission of our organization are eligible for similar assistance. And we don't control the messaging and the choosing of recipients for those benefits. So partnerships with non-state organizations is an excellent avenue, and I'd be happy to answer questions. If we do get into specifics, I'll follow up individually.
Are there any questions here or thoughts from task force members?
I don't have a question, but more of a comment. I'm a representative of a state organization, Department of Food and Agriculture. And we do use Virus Screen in some of our grant programming. We run into some issues when we're talking about rural communities, specifically farmers and ranchers, in which we're talking about in this case with the Land Equity Task Force, because it's targeting a zip code or an area where there might be, our target goal is either a certain race or ethnicity of farmers and ranchers, and we're talking about a zip code or an area where there might be someone, very affluent person, who's able to qualify for that funding because of where the farm is located versus where they actually reside and things like that. There's some nuances that perhaps would be important to consider or provide guidance on if we're indeed incorporating this into our future recommendations as a task force.
Thank you. That's a good point.
And I also would note, I'm not sure, based on your research, Caleb, or with other examples in our state and others where income is being tracked. It's typically a very personal question for people to respond to, and hard to use it as a proxy, although I know it is used in a lot of cases. So.
I think, yeah, to that point, Caleb, can you speak more to, I know that you were looking at beginning farmers, but it seems like that was primarily the category that all of these programs were built around. Is that right?
Yeah, I didn't do a super extensive look into this, but none of the research that I found suggested that they were considering, any of the other states were considering any other factor besides whether or not a person was a beginning farmer and whether or not they were eligible for the policies and programs that they had in place.
Are there other questions or thoughts here? We will look quickly at the calendar screen in just a minute. Thea, I think your comments will be really valuable to think more about. But does anyone have any other thoughts, questions here related specifically to Prop 209 and then how it shapes the way that state agencies can design their programs?
I have questions, but all of them are incredibly specific. So maybe a follow-up would be good. Happy to connect, Doug.
Great.
Thanks, James. And specific meaning like very specific cases. Is there any kind of broader level that you feel like the subcommittee might want to consider? And if the answer is no, that's fine. I'm just wondering if there's kind of like a broader.
It's all very hypothetical based, and it feels like it'll take too much time to do. Yeah, I think it's such a nuanced and complicated thing that involves all these kind of nesting challenges that yeah, I think the only way I'll get clarity is with like a one-on-one, so that Doug can like.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah. And thanks for entertaining my my follow-up question. Appreciate that. I'm happy to connect you, Paul.
Great, thank you.
And thank you, Doug, for joining us and giving us and offering to connect as task force members have other questions. Appreciate that.
Of course. All right. Thank you all.
So as we keep talking, of course, if there are things that come up that we do feel like we want to pass along as a group to Doug, I'm sure that he would be willing to hear those questions from us and has already helped us in so many ways as a task force. So, okay, any other thoughts here? And if not, let's spend there's a lot of text on this screen. I know I tried my best to kind of consolidate a bit. To say what the California Climate Investments uses to define priority populations. So the reason why the CCI, California Climate Investments, is so critical for the subcommittee's understanding of the kinds of programs that are currently offered by the state is because a lot of the programs that would be relevant for agricultural land equity are funded, or they are California Climate Investments programs, meaning they are funded through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, that cap and trade program. So things like SALC, Healthy Soils program, quite a range of programs are funded through this CCI framework. And so these two pieces of legislation were passed that set a specific target, 35% of program funding at the sort of broadest level, so 35% across programs, CCI programs, must be allocated to priority populations, which then of course required a definition of priority populations. So as you heard, Prop 209 would limit the ways that race or gender or national origin could be used as an explicit form of preferential prioritization. So that is not part of these definitions. The one that Thea mentioned, and I think Thea, it'd be great to return to some of your comments here. Maybe we can take kind of notes and think through how it will be helpful for the recommendations that you might want to propose to the full task force, is using the CalEnviro screen. And so disadvantaged communities are determined by Cal EPA using this CalEnviro screen tool, which is developed and managed by them. And it's the top 25% with the highest pollution burden, and it's by census tract, are automatic. They are then called disadvantaged communities. And there are a couple other specific carve-outs, like for a lack of data in CalEnviro screen. And then there's a note about 2017 disadvantaged communities are still, even though it was updated. So there's kind of some specific carve-outs, but it's based on this CalEnviro screen data. And that has quite a range of indicators. And as Thea, I don't know if it's Thea or Doug mentioned, those include income, they include levels of pollution, environmental health factors, things like that, are how these CalEnviro screen scores are calculated. And the briefing materials do include links to some of the very specific information about how that's done. And this disadvantaged communities also includes lands under the control of federally recognized tribes. The other definition of priority population are low income communities and households, incomes of either at or below 80% of statewide median, or below this threshold designated by the Department of Housing and Community Development. And those are on a program by program basis, is how those thresholds are designed. So I want to kind of pause here, and maybe while this slide is up, see whether anyone has any immediate responses to how this does or does not track with your own experience of the task force's priorities and or being able to discern highest need, right, in different parts of the state.
So I have just a question, because usually when using CalEnviro screen, it's to define these parameters for a geographical area or a population of people. And I'm wondering, can you apply it to an individual applicant?
From my understanding, the way that CalEnviro screen is useful is you can have an applicant, and that applicant's address then is what is used to determine whether they fall within one of the priority communities defined as a disadvantaged community. Right. So, and that's done by census tract. Does that answer your question, Doria?
Yeah, that's what I kind of thought, but just because somebody lives within the census tract doesn't mean that they actually are experiencing the conditions of the people around them, you know?
Yes.
That's what I was referring to earlier, Doria, in terms of what we've come across at CDFA in our Climate Smart Ag programs, and that they do ask that we are able to ask the question, applicants can fill out that check the box of where they live, but that doesn't, it's not an individual characteristic of an individual farmer or rancher, in which case we're generally talking about within the context of land equity or land access. But it is a tool that can be used.
Thea, you mentioned that in, I think, Doria, your point is equally true in urban areas as it could be in rural, but Thea, you mentioned rural areas in particular might get quite difficult to use census tract, right, to understand some of these disparities. Did you have any other kind of?
Well, it just depends on where the person lives, and I think we've all established as a part of this task force, a big part of land equity and land access is also the fact that many people can't live where they farm. So I don't know if that's an advantage to using this tool or not. I don't know what it's a case by case scenario, or maybe region by region, what those pressures might be. Maybe in some cases this tool might be great. In other cases, it may not be, given the fact that, like Doria said, just because you live in that census tract doesn't mean you are a disadvantaged person, an individual. And we have great disparities within different regions of our state in terms of wealth.
I would think too that there might be pros and cons depending on the applicant, whether or not they choose to use a farm address or a residential address.
Well, I can show you the kind of questions. We've already started talking about this, but show you some of the questions. Some of them were I had shown earlier, following Caleb's comments, right, as models from other states. But before we kind of get into reviewing some of the ideas that have already been put forward, and for the sort of next part of the discussion today, just wondering whether any of the information that you did here today is, does it sort of shape, or are there ways that you'd like to either have staff record or think together as a group that will be important for shaping the way that the recommendations you put forward, how they might be written, or what kinds of considerations you might want to make sure to include, I suppose. It sounds like that note about the difference between about the issue of using like a location to then designate whether someone is a priority community or not, that itself is a bit of a challenge. Might not be as effective in achieving the task force's goals as other ways of identifying priority.
I also wonder, if it is possible to use, like, what kind of constraints can you put on eligibility, if any? You know, could there be like an income-based eligibility criteria? Or would that not be acceptable for Prop 209?
As far as my understanding, that would not be prohibited by Prop 209. It is very much specific to race, national origin, and gender.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that mechanism that Doug mentioned, and I'm aware of what we're terming in CDFA block grant style, or intermediaries where you're partnering with other non-state entities as a mechanism to avoid, or not avoid, but as a mechanism to be able to serve certain areas or groups might be something that we consider in our recommendations as a model for, and there were examples in the research that Caleb did to further ensure that the goals of the task force are still included there.
Yeah.
I would say with income, while there are tools, it creates another layer for the state government, if it's a state government entity, creating a program to collect data. Those mechanisms aren't quite standardized, or maybe they are, but that would be another thing for us to consider if that's a qualification for a program.
There are areas within California categorized as persistent poverty areas, persistent poverty counties. But I think that leaves a lot of people out.
Do you know, Leah, we can do some more research into that. Do you know kind of what holds that definition, like that persistent poverty definition?
I don't remember where it comes from, but I know that there's some grant sources that we are utilizing that has enabled us to work within a specific area, offering very specific funding for persistent poverty. I want to say it's counties. I know Fresno is one, but there are areas in every county that need to be supporting here. And so I don't think that it's the right fit for us. Not to dissuade you from diving deeper.
Thank you. Other thoughts here, and of course that can be in the back of everyone's mind as we look at some of the ideas that had already been brought forward related to grants and resources by the task force at other moments. So if there's any, we can stay on this a bit longer if anyone has other thoughts, or we can also move to that. Seeing no hands in this moment, I believe our next step would actually be, let me make sure I'm right. I think it's public comment, because that concluded that piece of research output and discussion, and then we'll launch into this next working session. So are there any members of the public who would like to provide public comment?
If so, you're also welcome to use the raised hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen in lieu of filling out the form here. There's a small group of us today.
And there are no public comments online via that form.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, sorry.
No,
Someone,
you're good.
oh, maybe, okay. I just heard a voice. Okay, so I know we kind of split this into two sessions, but really they just blur from one to the next. There's been so many. I'll just start before we jump into some of these very specific ideas. I just want to share that there actually so much of what the task force has put forward in its variety of conversations in this subcommittee, but also when the full task force has met, or in different avenues, right, of conversation that have a lot to do with the funding landscape. And here are just a few. You'll see all of them, and you have been seeing them delivered to you in the form of the work plan, and then in February with that very first draft. But this is a kind of selected grouping of that, because as I was going through and pulling out some language for us to talk about today, I was thinking that if I want to put to you all as subcommittee members, is it helpful to kind of ask what would an ideal funding landscape look like, to almost map that out? So that point, Thea, you had brought up earlier about using block grants as one way of, giving public dollars to work that is prioritized by, you know, this task force or by the state, that then is more responsive to the kinds of nuance or the kinds of need that's not going to be captured in a county level or a census tract level data, right? Things like that. But then also we have heard that it's really important for individuals to have more direct access to some of these programs. What would it take to, rather than funding going to another layer of intermediary, are there ways that actually there are some that are a more close or immediate direct relationship? So there's kind of tensions there, but maybe they're not tensions. Maybe they're just different avenues in the landscape, if that makes sense. So I kind of want, there are some ideas here, and we can take any of these and start to talk about them. I think the accessibility issue is an interesting one too, right? Because the comment that we need to make programs accessible to individuals, and that will take a lot of new ways of designing programs, but also the comment that technical assistance providers really are ready to help. If we can fund them for increased capacity, you can fund increased dollars out the door to individuals. So I think there's some different things here that I would like to put to all of you to ask, are these pieces of like a broader landscape, a broader puzzle, or are there some of these that are more priorities than others? I hope that question makes sense, and I hope it's a useful place to start. Just wondering if anyone has any responses on the ideas here or thoughts about how they fit together based on the conversation we've already started having.
So I just would say that these do look like kind of ideal funding landscape program types. I would add the one that Thea brought forward around having land trusts or entities like land trusts be an intermediary on sales. So they can move more quicker than individuals and kind of hold a property and then transfer it over. I feel like that is also, there's a piece around timing and collecting together capital that that really speaks to that strategy. So I would add that to the program types or support types as well.
Thank you, Patrick.
I'd second that. I like the question. Well, I like the idea of mapping the landscape a little bit. And one thing that keeps jumping into my head is like is actually trying to create kind of hypothetical scenarios and playing them out to see how far you get. Because I also think there's I don't know why, but for some reason flowcharts have been very helpful for me lately. And like I actually think like flowchart outing some of this stuff could be really helpful for people who are like trying to learn. Like this is such a, like from an accessibility standpoint, like sometimes it's really, really complicated and like all the different steps and things like that. And so I don't know, I'm just kind of offering that as food for thought. But yeah, I think this is like a good distillation.
Can I just ask a follow-up question to James? When you say flow chart these options out, are you thinking about that as a resource for potential applicants or as a way for this subcommittee to work through what would be the best option?
In my mind, more the latter, but if it's helpful, then both. And I think there's like a lot of different ways to do it, but if it was like block grant, like, or, I don't know, just kind of like I think the hypothetical like person entity situation, I think is more helpful for like gaming out how these would all land in those circumstances. The flowchart thing I think is more helpful for like accessibility and being able to like, yeah, I just think it's helpful. It can be. That could just be me though, but just like anything we can do to like streamline people's like ability to quickly understand what all of these things entail would be good.
As we think about flow charting, which I'm all on board with that too, because these transactions are much more complex than the couple of bullet points that they're stating in practice. And I think I've mentioned this before, but I'll say it again here because I don't remember what is happening in what conversations anymore. Um, when we're thinking about these transactions, I really encourage us to think cradle to cradle about them and think beyond just a single transaction. Once we are facilitating land access, we are engaged in a project of wealth building for that farmer. But I also want to think about what happens at the next transaction and the next transaction so that these state-supported transactions aren't inadvertently creating a pathway for, cash buyers and investors to then come and scoop up lands at subsidized rates. That's not what this is intended for. So we need to be thinking beyond the initial transaction. Because as we learned at our last meeting, getting free land or subsidized land is not the end of your financial responsibilities to that land. And farming is hard. And so not all farmers are going to be successful on that land or be able to, sustain the financial burdens of that land, even if they are given a subsidized access point. So if they do end up needing to sell, how do we ensure that the next transition of that land is continuing to benefit the same population of farmers and ranchers in the state that we're hoping that it will. So long way of saying, let's think cradle to cradle about these transactions in as much perpetuity as our minds will allow us to bend. And then while I've got the floor, one more. We were talking a little bit too earlier about the grant programs. I think Thea was talking about what is the actual interaction when we put some of these programs together in cooperation. And so I really like to think about the kind of the capital stack, what'll get a farmer there. And maybe one farmer will only need a small grant to help them, move with closing costs, but maybe some will need to kind of stack these programs to make a transaction happen. So I like to think about like down payment assistance grants coupled with low interest loans that maybe even are forgivable over time, right? So you make a certain number of payments. If you hold that land, if you meet these conservation goals, you are eligible, to have, the loans forgiven over time. I think there's some really interesting kind of incentive concepts out there that we can borrow from, like community land trusts and housing as well. There have been some great kind of forgivable loan products that exist out there that haven't yet really been applied to agricultural lands that I think could be really interesting.
Yeah, it's similarly, it's all of the conversations are kind of course intertwined. But in terms of our work here as a subcommittee, focusing on the mechanisms, maybe there are a couple of those ones from other states that were mentioned in the research. But what do we need here in California? We don't actually have those things that were mentioned. And maybe that is part of our recommendation as a subcommittee is like, what are those policy pieces that we want to potentially recommend for what will work in California? And then also coupled with those specific examples like Leah mentioned, I think that's really important, that flexibility. The flexibility in what things can be used for depending on the circumstance, and forgivable loans like, considerations for tribal held land. Maybe those are just layers of pieces or examples that we can point to in the state for consideration of policymakers when they're coming, when they're going to create a program like this. What do they need to include? What do we need to make sure that they're aware of?
Would it,
The accessibility part, I think that's also really important. I'm not sure how that fits into some of the other, to me, that is across all the things that we're doing in this as a task force. So I don't know how that's going to fit into here. It's very important. But maybe that's a key thread throughout all of the things that we're recommending here.
it seems like maybe, so is it, I feel like there are maybe two things that right now have like emerged from the conversation so far that staff could like bring back for further consideration. Some of them would be maybe going back through that research, and we welcome subcommittee members too to also do this. I know that you already highlighted one program that looked especially interesting, but maybe some like case study program examples that could come back to the subcommittee for consideration as models, right, for that could be brought into the state of California. So that seems like one thing that might be a next step here, I'm hearing here. And then the second thing I'm hearing here that might be a next step is trying to visualize, like design out how is someone moving through the process of stacking capital, of leveraging a funding landscape to acquire land in such a way that that land, as Leah was pointing to, remains accessible and remains a space to build wealth and live well on that land for priority communities for the task force. So it sounds like those are like two things that could maybe come from today and come back to you all and consider next steps from there. Are there ways that any of you, I mean, the kind of next point that I had, I mean, we're good on time, so we're doing well. The next point that I had was to think about the working groups. So we can kind of stay here a bit longer and keep thinking through some of these specifics. We have some additions to add into this, make sure that they're in this list or to look a bit further into. I'm wondering if we also want to think about the working groups and how those groups might be able to move some of the things that I just mentioned that kind of seem like maybe next steps, and trying to get a bit closer to having those specific pieces of the recommendations that come from the subcommittee. So we can go to working groups, or if anyone has anything else to sort of add here. Do you all think it would be helpful if we kind of took this list plus the one that was highlighted that's not on this program types point, like the kind of intermediary holder, right, to make that land purchase more accessible to farmers? So is that something to then maybe use as a list to go look at those other state programs and pull out some case studies of successful, maybe not even in other states, but kind of successful examples of these? Is that a helpful way to organize that work?
I think that could be. I seen that some of the research that was done maybe wasn't conclusive, but that was the researcher's perspective. I don't know if, I know some of those were recently published too, 2024. So if you can have any, if there are any examples or
I also wondered if some of the examples we were thinking about were actually things that we heard about from non-state sources. You know, they were, you know, philanthropic sources or other things that were paying for this. I'm not sure if do we have to limit it to state programs for that, or could we look at what kind of foundations, philanthropic organizations, or nonprofits are doing in order to, in that realm that are successful, and seeing if we can apply it to a state model.
That's a nice idea, and I do know I'll go forward just to the working group check-in slide. Oh, it looks like I was gonna go through them one by one, but I'm gonna actually just put them all right up here, just to remind you all of what your working groups are. Just look at that first slide for a second. You have your tax laws and incentives working group, your financing working group, and then your grant program outcomes working group. Of course, these are very informal, right? That's the reason why they're good is because they give two task force members the chance to collaborate in a more informal way. But I am thinking, Doria, to the point you just brought up, maybe in the financing working group, that might be a place to start to like pull together some of these other examples that you've heard about that might be helpful for mapping, or just even going back to David Mancera's presentation and charting him in some ways, right? Like charting that process as one of those mapping type exercises that had been mentioned. Of course, not alone, staff are here to assist, but now just trying to kind of think, how can we maybe plug in some of these like concrete, areas into the structure that we have, or consider a new structure. I can share with you all what these points are maybe, and then we can talk a bit about kind of where to go from here. The tax laws and incentives working group, Leanne, James. I know that, so we did hear today about some tax incentives, right? This beginning farmer tax credit in particular programs. And from the research Caleb had done, those, first of all, focus on beginning farmers as category. And second of all, generally the benefit goes to the land holder and it's indirect benefit, right, to the beginning farmer. So I know that this is something that's come up in this group quite a bit. And I know there was a request to speak with a tax specialist to understand like the California specific context, what's possible, what's already out there. And so I have a question back to the working group, but actually the whole group here today. See if you could speak, what about taxes are you interested in learning that might then help you to formulate some of those suggestions for the California context? So I put up here, I mean, we have our Board of Equalization. They handle property taxes, which is separate from that franchise tax board, which handles personal and business income taxes. So there are two forms of tax credit that are related to the work of this task force that actually fall under these different agencies. The Williamson Act falls under that BOE property taxes, and then the Natural Heritage Preservation Tax Credit falls under that franchise tax board. So it's quite a complicated landscape, and I'm just wondering how we might be able to help you move that forward. Leanne, James, if you have ideas, or the full subcommittee, if anyone has questions that we can help you ask.
I have like two. There is like an inward and an outward version of questions that I have for a tax specialist. And it's kind of, the inward is more like, what don't we know about tax law that could benefit kind of the goals that we have as a task force in terms of incentives, both for landowners and for producers and for counties? Like, just kind of like, the question I would ask somebody is like, if you were designing, or based on what you know about existing tax incentives and write-offs and opportunities through the tax code system, like, what do you think the best carrots are? What are the best sticks? Like those kinds of questions. And also at some point, once we start drafting recommendations, like what are the limitations? Like it's this kind of like, what could there be out there that we don't know about yet? And where does it butt up? Like where would it later then butt? That's like a down the road kind of thing of like I think once we start drafting recommendations, I think they should always be filtered through like a tax person and a law person, just to like, because I feel like we're gonna write these in a very like plain, clear way that's not legalese, and then it needs to get like filtered at some point, or like, you know, like translated. Yeah.
Thank you, James. That's helpful. That helps guide who to go to bring to you to learn more. So that's helpful. Helpful. I appreciate that.
I agree with all of that. The tax incentives that are talked about are usually in benefit of landholders to increase land access. And like we was mentioned, and I completely agree with that, you know, that's gatekeeping. And it really interesting to hear, like, actually, it's not really facilitating new lease and ownership transactions. It's just benefiting those that are existing, and it's predominantly, you know, white males. So, shocker. But I'm wondering if there are ways to take what our other states have learned and improve upon some of those tax benefits and options. What is possible in the state of California with regards to existing tax incentives? And then what is possible with regards to tax incentives that would directly benefit farmers? I'm suggesting a yes, and we do still need to incentivize the leasing, long-term leasing to beginning farmers. But we need to do, you know, build on that. But I'm wondering, like, are there certain tax incentives that we can implement for, you know, paying farmers student loans, or paying for the increased of costs of insurance in this state, other types of costs that farmers are facing, increasing costs in this state, and kind of how to use tax tools to potentially offer benefits and incentives to farmers. And then I'm also curious about what can be done at the state level with regards to succession, and how taxes are managed upon transition of ownership of land and ownership of business in the state, and whether there are some ways we can get creative, because right now, not a tax specialist, but the way that the laws are created make it disincentivize the transition of business and land during a farmer's lifetime. And
Right.
that is typically kind of, we live a long time now, and it's typically making it really challenging to transition ownership to a new generation when you don't have that person to communicate with anymore. So I'm curious how we can get creative, and obviously those are going to only be a piece of the puzzle here because it's just state taxes, but anything helps.
Thank you, Leah. That's helpful too. So I think what you both just shared. Oh, James, I see you're unmuted. Go ahead.
This doesn't fit well into tax law and incentives, but debt forgiveness feels like something that we should put on the table at some point if it's not caught somewhere else, as well, like as an alternative. Like if like the tax code laws, etc., are just too complex for some of this stuff, like is there an option to do debt forgiveness? And I think we have like do we have a succession working group? Okay, cool. Yeah, the other thoughts I had were just around like estates and trusts, and how to avoid like probate and things like that for people as they're transitioning, so that they get to retain the majority of that asset value as it moves from generation to generation. But okay.
Okay, that's helpful to get a sense of what kinds of questions you would have to explore further, and we'll continue to try to move those questions along. But you each did bring up that it immediately opens up many more kinds of questions that are connected with other areas of work for this task force. So just appreciate your help tracking that and then communicating that out to the full task force too for their tracking. I'm wondering, we have the financing and then the grant program outcomes working groups as well. So right now in the financing working group doc, there's a link to David Mancera's presentation in there, and then some like questions and proposed next steps. So that might be something that we can sort of offline, James and Doria, think through what might be valuable. I do know that in our November task force meeting, it was brought up that thinking about philanthropy would be valuable. So right now, the way the Grants and Resources Subcommittee, David Mancera talked quite a bit about philanthropy. That was the kind of primary area that capital was built. But it hasn't yet been quite the same focus as some of the research tasks we've had, things like that. So I am wondering to what extent this subcommittee might want to think of ways to make sure that part of the landscape is then included. And maybe the financing working group is a place to do some of that, to think through those connections.
You mean connections with private? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Doria.
No, go ahead. That's fine.
You mean connections to like private financing. Yeah, I think that's the right place for that to be. And I think it will kind of mirror the state in terms of research around which the only and even truly at this stage, like they're both going to be variable in terms of how long those funding streams are available. So I think that's okay to just have resources available for both.
Doria, go ahead.
I think I was just generally agreeing that it's a good place to look into that and kind of use the same parameters, but apply it to private funding sources and private initiatives.
Kind of that landscape, building out that landscape a bit.
Yeah. And I think maybe adding to that, the only thing that I might consider or might want to put out there for consideration is how could kind of public-private partnerships work to advance the goals of the task force, you know?
And by that, Doria, do you mean kind of things that align in some ways with that fourth strategy that Doug mentioned, in terms of how the state can fund programs that meet its priorities by working with non-state entities? Is that
Yep.
kind of what's described there? Okay.
That's exactly what I mean. And also some of the continuum that we were talking about is like, you know, thinking beyond the acquisition and, you know, how do we ensure kind of long-term success and you know, I think there's different moments where a partnership with private entities would be helpful in order to achieve the goals.
Great. Thank you both. Okay, that's exciting. So it sounds like you have some places to build that out. And then the grant program outcomes working group, Doria and Thea, you're there. And I think with this one, really, as Tessa mentioned, and we can bring Tessa back into the conversation, this might be maybe the opportunity for this working group to engage with that research a bit more deeply, right? Those outcomes that Tessa's working on. So I had connected with Tessa earlier, and we thought that it kind of can be, you both can think about what might be a way that you would like to learn about or engage with that research process and its findings. So there might not be an answer to that right now, but that's kind of how we're imagining this working group would move that grant program outcomes question along, would be in collaboration with Tessa and the work she's doing. And then of course that comes to subcommittee and then eventually the full task force as well.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, about those 12 programs that we're doing, that you all are, Tessa, thank you, Tessa, is doing that survey. So there are 11 state programs and 1 federal program. And are they all just focused on like the acquisition part of like land, like the acquisition process or getting access to land, or are they kind of adjacent to that with other things. I'm just trying to better understand maybe what some of those program outcomes might be, if any, and what that might tell us about what we could potentially include as a recommendation here in terms of what do we need to be measuring to know if people are better off in this case if they have access to land in order to farm.
Yeah, so when we talked, and it's been a long time, but when we've talked about the metrics in the past, you all were very focused on acres as one of those metrics. And so the conversation kind of centered around those tangible metrics. So how many dollars are we investing in this work, and how many acres are being transitioned as a result, and then some demographic information too. And so we tried to select the programs that most clearly got at that work. And so it's land conservation programs like SALC. Those would be programs that are, directing money either towards land acquisition or purchasing conservation easements. And then there's other conservation programs, and I'm happy to share this list of 12 programs again with you all. I'm just looking now. There is the CDFA Urban Ag Grant Program because there were some eligible activities in there that felt very tightly related to land access. And so we just tried to select a reasonable number, a manageable number, and those programs that were most directly, having to do with land access.
Yeah, I'd be curious if we might be able to make some kind of a baseline statement or assessment, given that there's a lot of different timelines and programs and maybe not the same questions asked, but hopefully, I'll be interested to look at that list and let me know how it could be helpful. So I remember back last year when Doria and I were talking about this and the importance of acreage. And I'm just still wondering, are we even going to get that information? Does it exist? Have people collected it? I don't know.
Yeah, right. And depending on what we find, the recommendations will probably look very different. So it might just be, hey, we need to fill this gap, or you just mentioned a baseline.
Right. Or something that we need to establish a baseline, or how can we get at that given potentially working through public-private partnerships or other intermediaries, or those funding mechanisms differ from then just a straight state program. You could standardize data collection.
Right, that could be something, lesson learned from looking at some philanthropic models.
Well, thanks for your work on that, Tessa. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I think it will be very helpful to have this kind of smaller convening, in addition, of course, to the subcommittee and the task force hearing about the insights. But Doria and Thea, to have you kind of thinking, what can we see in this data that we have, whatever it is, or whatever, and then what can't we see, and really thinking through how those two things then make it into that report in one way or another. So I appreciate your interest in getting tangled up in that and thinking through that.
Yeah, and one of the questions that we had was about timing as well. So I mentioned the end of February, that's roughly the timeline we're hoping to work on. So I could either, synthesize that data and share it out with this working group, and then we can talk about how we want to bring that back to this subcommittee. Or I can bring it to the subcommittee first, and then the three of us can, get in a bit more depth after we hear from the full subcommittee. I think probably pros and cons to either, but if Thea and Doria have a preference, I'm happy to hear that.
No, okay.
Yeah, if not, that's fine. We'll keep you updated.
We'll figure out time, and maybe timing will be the way that gets decided on Ted, as you mentioned. Well, I think we really have gone through a lot of the things we were hoping to talk about today. I'm feeling like, and I know Megan can help us too to kind of recap and see these points and where we're going next. But I'm wondering just from subcommittee members whether you feel like you have a sense of what you would want to start working on next to move to that next through that February 1st draft and onto that next kind of moment that the subcommittee reconvenes or re-engages with the work. So yeah, just kind of a check-in to see whether feeling like we've got some good next steps and we can move to close out from here. If there are other comments or if we'll have any other ideas.
Well, I'm feeling a bit squishy myself.
Okay, tell us why.
Well, I guess I'm looking for the conversation today was great. And I felt like it was, in some ways expansive and in some ways narrowing. But I guess I'm feeling squishy on what's happening between now and we've got a full task force meeting booked February, mid-February, as you all know, the 12th and the 13th. So I just can we spend just 30 seconds or a minute talking about maybe some individual personal goals on what we might want to do before that? I don't know, like to do the collaborative Google Docs, are they still feeling like a pretty good space to jot some notes? And if yes, maybe folks want to commit to like by the end of in 2 weeks, like January 23rd, to have gone in to your working documents and just shared out some ideas in there. Do you want us to help set up little coordination calls for working groups on the in-between? I mean, there's no way we're going to do a full subcommittee call between now and February, but we're also trying to prepare productive sessions for February as well. So we got maybe a couple of weeks to do a little bit more advancement on this if it feels like we can.
I will say that kind of based on Camille's summary now, 20 minutes ago or so, I do feel like staff might have a couple of like short-term next steps before we might convene back with those working groups. And so, for example, that sort of flow charting mapping, I think is something we're kind of bringing over from the last subcommittee meeting of this subcommittee, and we can probably do some work on that. And then we have the tax laws and incentives. We've been thinking about who we can bring in, and we just got a lot of clarity on that. So that's kind of what's coming to the top of mind for me. And Camille, of course, yeah, feel free to clarify because I know you're leading a lot of this work.
Can we go back one slide, actually?
Of course. Oh, sorry, you're gonna go back. This one, Megan?
Yeah, what you described to me, Tessa, makes a lot of sense, especially related to the working groups. Just kind of put a plug in there for, open brainstorming space. This one, I didn't want to pipe in with my half-baked ideas here when you all were talking about this, but I know that we're thinking about flow charting this, but is this also a space where we could use, when I say we, I mean subcommittee members in addition to support staff, but the great ideas are coming from you all. Could we use this list and kind of expand it out, like talk about how you would want block grants applied or individual grants applied, like put a little bit more detail on these things in terms of what an ideal funding landscape would look like? Somewhere in here we have to add the loan forgiveness piece. Maybe it fits here, maybe it doesn't.
Probably low interest forgivable reverse amortization loans are 3. I'm sorry, Doria, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you weren't cutting me off at all. I'm just vigorously shaking my head on the low interest forgivable
Okay.
loan edition.
Could this be maybe shared Excel in that folder somewhere so we could just build this out a little bit more individually, contribute to it to help maybe bring something to the February meeting that's a little bit more robust.
Yeah, and what we can't do is create a editable Excel doc that has more than 2 task force members engaged in it at a time. But you have working groups. So what we can do is we will, sounds like maybe we can make an Excel version of this. Maybe we can also just make a doc where it's kind of listed, and then working group, and share that with the working groups. And then you can use those spaces and then it's up to staff to kind of consolidate, piece together those feedback and share it back with task force per Bagley King. That's kind of how it has to work. But we can do that. So I hear that request. Make sure that this language is, and with the additions from today, make sure that that updated language is shared with you so that you can provide feedback, build it out.
That
Great.
sounds like something that might be helpful too for the full meeting too in February. Because I don't know if we're at the point where we can write a recommendation to go into a draft recommendation, because I still trying to wrap my head around all the other groups and what those draft recommendations are going to look like. But maybe we'll get more clarity on that in February.
But I think we're forward, right? We've got some concepts, so that's great.
I was just going to ask really quickly, Thea, when you said would be helpful for the February meeting too, do you mean the kind of thing where language is shared for task force members to engage with in advance of February is helpful for February? I just wanted to make sure I understood what you were saying.
Well, I don't really know what's on the agenda yet for February, but if we're doing another working session where we're getting more into what we came up into the framework that we started in November, maybe these additional ideas that we're coming up with related to grants and resources, or just this ideal funding landscape we're talking about here, would be helpful to steer a recommendation or one or more recommendations that we're working on in February. So I don't know if people have to have them beforehand or on the actual meeting. I'm not sure. That's your call, probably.
Understood. Thank you for clarifying. Yeah, that's helpful. We'll think definitely these ideas will definitely be part of that February conversation. So to be able to move them along further before that will be valuable. Megan, are you feeling less squishy?
More solid. How's everyone else doing? More solid or squishiness levels 1 to 10? Yes, I think this is good. Okay.
So quickly on working groups, just to say, so staff will do what we just said about that language, and then follow up with you all and say, language now in your working group, doc, like that. We'll make sure you all are getting those updates so that you can keep that work moving. And to Tessa's point, there's a few things that we might be able to add in there, or a conversation that we could plan for Leah and James, right? Like that for the tax specialist. Those kinds of things will continue moving forward. Okay.
Great.
I know,
sorry, Camille, just pausing quickly to see if there's any public comments on the working session discussion.
Sorry, I don't see any online.
Okay. Likewise. Great. Sorry, Camille, carry on.
No, that was it. I was going to say public comment. You did it. Thank you, Megan.
All right, so we kind of just did a review of what we're doing next. Next meeting is the full task force meeting in February. Do you all want us to do a little scheduling effort to try to proactively get something booked following February, say for early March? Yeah, okay. Then we're going to do that. So be on the lookout. Wonderful. As always, if something comes up, you've got an idea that is sparked, if there's something that you would like assistance with in terms of reaching out to someone, coordinating a call or a meeting, we're here. Let us know how we can help. general public comments. Any general public comment related to task force business outside the scope of just grants and resources, but related to task force business generally? Anything on your end, Tessa?
Doesn't look like it. Nope.
Okay, no general public comment. We've got a couple more meetings of subcommittees coming up, and some folks today are also subcommittee members from some of these other groups. You don't have to be a member to tune in, but if you are a task force member and you are not a subcommittee member, just a reminder, you'll have to participate as an attendee in observation mode to be in compliance with Bagley Keene Open Meeting Act policy. So next week we do land use and governance, and then the following week we've got land access, acquisition, and ancestral land return. We're using the acronym LA3 for that. The following day is land tenure, and then the next week we do sustaining natural and cultural resources, or SNCR. And then just a few days after that, we'll all be together for the full task force meeting. That meeting space will be in Coachella Valley with an option for virtual attendance. And all of this great material is posted on our project website, as always. So we hope to see some virtually next week and in person soon, but we'll be in touch. Okay.
Thank you all.